I'd like to just start off as well by acknowledging the land on which we meet. And in my case, I'm on the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and as the traditional owners and custodians of this land, you know, I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I want to especially thank the City of Melton for inviting me to speak today, and to Rachel and Karen as well. It really is an absolute pleasure. The only thing that I will say is that I wish that we were in a room together so we could, you know, extend the chat over a cup of tea afterwards, or at least I'd get the signals to wrap me up a bit faster if I go on a bit longer. But as Rachel mentioned, you know, you were very generous painting my career story. I'm going to sort of take you through a little bit of that journey along the way. But I just thought I'd start off by saying, you know, when I was 28, and Rachel, I did feel as you were doing the introduction, it makes me sound really old, and well, makes me feel really old. But at 28 years of age, which was 32 years ago. So for those of you doing the quick calculation, yes, I did turn 60 in January. But 32 years ago, I was the first woman appointed to the board as an executive director of Clemenger BBDO. And at that time, my son was 1, and I found out that I was pregnant with my second child. And look, really, honestly, today, that really wouldn't be such a big deal. But in the context of the time when that happened, it really was a big deal. In fact, weirdly, it was a feature story on the front page of the business section of The Age that a woman had been appointed to the board of Clemenger BBDO. And I guess to put it in context, it was in that year that, for those that remember, you know, Joan Kirner became the first premier of a state in a state of Victoria, and she was the first female premier ever in this country. And it would actually take another 20 years from then when we saw our first female prime minister. At the time as well, Betty Churchill, who none of us will know because women get lost through history, but at that time, Betty Churchill became the first female director of a national cultural institution, and which was the National Gallery of Australia. And I'm always amused because I'm a great AFL fan, and I can joyfully say a Melbourne supporter, given that we won the grand final now after suffering for a lifetime. But at the same time I was appointed to the board, we were having the debate about whether women should be allowed to become members of the MCC, which for our daughters and sons, that just seems such a crazy thing to contemplate. But women weren't allowed in as members of the MCC until 1991. So back then it made the news. But interestingly for me, at that young age of 28, I actually set a long-term career goal to become a non-executive director. And at 54, exactly 6 years ago, I achieved that goal by becoming a full-time NED and being appointed to ASX 200 boards. Many people ask me, you know, how did I do it? What sacrifices I've made along the way, what hurdles I've faced, and importantly, how did my kids cope with all of that? So that's what I'd like to share with you today, how I went about doing it. I will say right up front, I didn't always get it right. I hate it when you hear people's life stories and they just wax lyrical about all the fabulousness of it. And it's not to say I haven't had great times, but I'd be absolutely lying if I pretended that I'd got it all right. If I pretended that I succeeded all the time, because I didn't. I had setbacks along the way. I do like to think, and Rachel and I did pick this funny topic about having it all, but which is sort of a bit of an annoying expression in a way, because you just want to stab people when they say they've had it all. I like to think that I've had it all because I've sort of done a mix of a whole lot of things, but I'm a strong believer that having it all is actually self-defined. You know, my all may not be your all, and vice versa. So I think that's really important as we, you know, when we think about this topic of having it all, it's not some panacea of someone else's all. It's just, it's what we choose to do ourselves. And I really firmly believe in that. And whilst I think each of our stories is unique, I hope that with what I share with you today, that it's helpful as you face into your own challenges in pursuit of you having your all. So I know many of you here today on the call are either running your own businesses or work in the community of Melton. And as I said, I hope that you're able to meet in person soon so you can share your stories with one another to add with what I'm going to share with you today. But before I get started, I'd really like to ask a question of all of you. We've got an online poll that I'd love you to participate in. And really, in all honesty, if we're all in the room together, we'd just be doing a quick hands up on this one. So it's really just a virtual way of doing the same thing. And my question really is, how many of you are juggling being the primary carer of kids or family at the same time as working or running your own business? So it's a quick yes or no, and I can see the yeses coming in already. Is there a couple of no's predominantly? No, it looks like 100% of you are saying yes, which is slightly ahead of the Australian average. So I'm not sure if you're all aware, but 7 in 10 primary carers in Australia.
I can't answer the poll, but my hand's up.
Okay. Okay. Well, we're going to end the poll now, but it's a resounding 100%, which is fantastic to get that insight. So thank you for responding to that. But I think with it's just such an interesting thing as we think about having it all, because it's sort of almost like, oh, that means have you sacrificed? What do you sacrifice along the way? And I think we have to be realistic as we look into the pursuit of our all. And I think, just in this 7 in 10 primary carers in Australia are women. And the compounding result of the disproportionate share of unpaid care is that women are less likely to be able to engage in full-time paid work. They're more likely to work part-time or casually. And they're more likely to work in occupations or industries that offer more flexibility, which is actually a great thing. I think that we've learned over COVID that more office occupations can be flexible, which should be of benefit to us going forward. But quite sadly, women are more likely to experience interruptions in their career. And for me, a big concern about that is that they're more likely to have substantially lower superannuation balances at retirement. And I think it's a real concern that we're seeing the increase in poverty amongst females in Australia, an increase in homelessness amongst women, and pretty poor superannuation balances as they face into retirement. And that's leading to some pretty significant social challenges. So I know it's not easy trying to do the juggle, and I know it's not easy dealing with the exhaustion that I know my friends and colleagues have talked about over the journey as well, about being completely exhausted. I know it's not easy being judged or overcoming the biases of, in a work context or also in a social context. I've sort of spent many years wondering whether I was being a good mother, and then at the same time wondering whether I was being good at work as well. But I really do believe that change is never easy. And I like to think about what I've done, and I'll share my story in a bit more detail in a minute, is as some small contribution to bring about change and make it just a little bit easier for our daughters and their daughters going into the future. So as we were talking about this week, we're celebrating International Women's Day with the theme of Break the Bias. And for me, and hopefully you, this theme's really provoked some great discussion around gender bias in the workplace and in society more generally. Great discussions around why is it that we've gendered certain roles? Why is it that we even gender childcare and have this expectation that females are the primary carers? I always say to people, just because I carried the child for 9 months doesn't mean that I have to be the sole person responsible for raising that child. And also I wasn't born with any special cleaning skills on the home front either. So for me, that's always been gendered, and I quite like challenging that and finding a husband that agreed in shared responsibilities, but we'll get to that later. So I think with the interesting discussions we've had around breaking the bias, I think in that context, I think about Australia, and whilst we've referred to Australia as the lucky country, I really do think our luck is running out, and now really is the opportunity for us to build a vibrant, smart and sustainable and more equitable economy, which uses every ounce of talent that we've got. And I think the impact of COVID has been great, and I'm sure you've each experienced it both in a work context and in a family context. But as we're coming out of COVID, what we're seeing from a business perspective, which is a huge challenge, is the shortage of labour. And I think one of our greatest untapped resources in Australia is actually women. So leveraging women's participation and leadership is actually one of the most effective actions for business and government to boost the Australian economy. And I saw some really interesting economic modelling that PwC has done recently that shows that if we halve the workforce participation gap between men and women, we'd increase Australia's GDP by $60 billion by 2038, which is extraordinary. And I actually like to think about this discussion around gender and diversity more in the context now about, rather than complaining about it, I put my hand up, I've been angry and complained about it most of my life. I think now we can have more constructive conversations around the contribution women can make, and in an economic context as well. And I think that message is going to be received far more positively by both business and in society as well. So I'm a big supporter for expanding parental leave for both men and women, and I do strongly believe it should be tax deductible. I think making quality early childhood education and care accessible is critical as we move forward, and I'm a big advocate for that. And importantly, making work a safe place for all. And I'm really encouraged that whilst it's been, painful for individuals, speaking up on this topic, I think, corporate Australia is really looking very deeply into some of the systemic problems and biases that exist in the workplace, and people's behaviours are being challenged rather than, perhaps just turning a blind eye to it. So I think we're living in a really interesting time at the moment, and I think it's a real opportunity for us to for both men and women to really step up now and think about how we can create a better environment for all. So that really turns me to the topic of today. And I know, we're going to talk a little bit about my story of building a career and raising kids and giving back, and hopefully, pushing towards a more equitable world. Some of you may already be thinking, well, that's sort of okay for you, being me, because as I mentioned before, I can relate that often we hear other people's stories and say, well, that's okay for you, that's not my situation. And as I said, it's your situations are each individual, and you'll make decisions about what you actually want to do. But I think the important thing is that you do set some goals and you work your way through how you achieve them. I think there is no doubt it is hard for both men and women balancing family and career. I think it's a real consideration how you face into that. I like to think that we can do it as a team, as opposed to just having to try and do that on your own. And there are trade-offs. And I do acknowledge the exhaustion that goes with it. I get exhausted sometimes even listening to my introduction, Rachel, about the things that I do. And I certainly don't do them all at once. But I do have a propensity to say yes to most things. So sometimes I have taken on too much and just got completely exhausted. But very briefly, Rachel mentioned that my background is in marketing and operations and digital. I've had a depth of experience working in and around China, and my executive career spanned working in advertising in the 80s, and it was exactly like Mad Men, for those people who have watched the Mad Men series. Even though that was set in the 60s, not much had changed in the 80s. And then into digital from the mid 1990s when the internet commercialized, and then working in operations, leading a manufacturing business in Australia and China before I joined Crown. And I will say I joined Crown and left Crown before all of the controversy that has arisen in recent times. I was part of the executive team at Crown. And then my final executive role, I spent the last 3 years living in China, working for a Chinese founded company. I did run a parallel board career from the age of 28 when I mentioned that, setting that long-term ambition. And I'll get into my board career a little bit later on. As Rachel mentioned today, I'm on the board of Vicinity, which for those who don't know is the big shopping centre REIT. So the shopping centres they own something like 68 shopping centres around Australia, including Chadstone here in Melbourne, Northland, some assets in the city, etc. I joined the board of Tabcorp during COVID. So I basically spent the first year on that board on Zoom, having not met anyone in person, but that's changed in more recent times. And I've been fortunate to be on the board of Costa, where I met Rachel. I'm coming up to 6 years on the Costa board and absolutely love working in the horticulture sector. And for those of you who don't know Costa, although I would assume most of you do, but I shouldn't assume, but you would know it through Driscoll's berries. Hopefully you eat lots of avocados and mushrooms and tomatoes and citrus, and we're Australia's largest horticultural business with operations all around Australia, growing berries up in China and also berries in Morocco. I'm on the board of a small private company which resides in Cordamentha, which is called KM Property Funds, and Visit Victoria is my voluntary board role. Rachel mentioned Mentor Walks, which if you don't know about Mentor Walks, I'd encourage you to Google it. It's a great organisation where we meet, walk around the Tan once a month with 2 or 3 mentees. And the mentees bring a burning question with them, and we help them solve that. I'm absolutely passionate about Youth Activating Youth, and Ahmed Hassan is the founder of that. And some of you may know Ahmed. He founded this organisation when he was 18 to support a lot of African youth in Melbourne, and he was honoured with being awarded the Victorian Young Australian of the Year. An extraordinary person doing extraordinary work in that area. And as Rachel mentioned, I'm also an advocate of an organisation called Culturally Diverse Women, which is founded by Div Pillay, also doing wonderful work in advocacy and supporting women from culturally diverse backgrounds. I've got 2 adult children now. Will, my son, is 30, and our daughter, Ali, is 28. And as I said, they survived being brought up by a mum who worked full-time. I took 2 to 3 months maternity leave. And I have to admit now, I don't know what I was thinking doing that. I think I was trying to prove something to the world or myself, but it was nuts. They also survived the fact that my husband and I left home before they did. We actually left them when we went to live in China for 3 years. I'm also passionate about the arts and love traveling, but that's sort of a faded memory for all of us at the moment, and love getting into the outdoors and hiking. I'll cover some aspects of my career just over the next sort of 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for some questions. I sort of like to think of my career under a couple of themes, and the first really around that whole idea of setting long-term career goals and in a way not hiding your ambition, stating upfront what it is that you want to do. I like to think around my career as to when I've taken risks, and I mentioned about I'm sort of a serial offender in saying yes to things and the problems that creates for me when I try to juggle work and family commitments. And then the last thing I want to touch on is the importance of networks and mentors and advocacy as well. So we just go back to that long-term goal setting. As I said, at 28, as a sort of a bit of a marketing hack, I set this goal to become a board director. I didn't actually say when that would be. The thought entered my mind. There were no role models. There were no female role models on boards of listed companies. So it was really an audacious goal to set. Some would say completely delusional, because, as I said, there weren't any women on boards, and those who were on boards were males that were either lawyers or accountants or retired CEOs. So it was sort of a bit radical, I think, that I thought with my background that I could even be considered to do that one day. But undeterred, I knew that I needed to broaden my skills and experience beyond advertising and marketing, and the importance of getting operational experience and having full P&L responsibilities. And I think this is really critical for women. Historically, we're drawn to more support roles or functional roles in organisations, and I think it's really important to get that exposure in having full P&L responsibility. So I knew that somewhere along my career I needed to do that. I think too, at the time, I really had this sort of short to medium term ambition to become the CEO of the advertising agency that I was working in, and I didn't really see much beyond that. But then the whole internet appeared. As I mentioned, in mid-1990, the internet commercialised, and it really set me off in a new direction, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. But I guess my point in talking about that goal is not to sort of go shock horror. She set that goal at 28. What was she thinking? It's really more to really ask you, and you don't have to answer this, but just to think in your own time, what's your long-term career goal or your long-term business goal? What are your aspirations beyond the work that you're doing today? And if you don't know, I'd really encourage you to think deeply about that, because, the stats show that we're more than likely going to live into our 90s. And if you like me, the idea of retiring isn't that appealing. But more importantly, I think about what do I want my life to be like when I'm 80 or 90. And as we all know, the decades go by pretty quickly. And all of a sudden we find ourselves in the second half of our life. And I suspect, the last quarter of our life will come up pretty quickly as well. So I sort of think about that long-term career planning. Certainly for me, working in advertising, I knew was a young person's industry. And when I looked around, there certainly at that time when I was 28, there weren't many. In fact, I don't think there were any women over 40 working in advertising. So that also got me thinking about what my career was going to be like post advertising. So just think about that in terms of that long-term career goal, business goal, life goal, and then work backwards from that. And what do you need to do now going forward to achieve those goals? That's why I think, just stepping back to that comment about superannuation, that's also like doing your own personal financial planning is important, to ensure that you've, really maximised your superannuation and your savings prior to that time, to give you the freedom of choice later on in life, and to go against the tide of where the stats are heading in Australia for women. The second topic I want to move on to is taking risks and saying yes and doing a bit of a juggle. So for me, throughout my career, I actually took some significant risks. I established myself in advertising. I was in a very senior role in a traditional agency. But as I said, when the digital world came along, I put my hand up to do a digital startup company within the company that I worked in. I also had some advice. As I was on the board, I had responsibility for people and culture, which was a bit of an oxymoron in an advertising agency, because certainly a lot of the behaviours and stuff that was going on in the 80s in advertising would have a lot of people in jail now. And the fact that I was responsible for HR, I don't know that I was that responsible, but anyway, so we had an external consultant working with me on people and culture in the agency. And one day we just had a chat generally about ambition and what my goals were. And as I mentioned, I sort of had set this goal within the context of the agency to one day run the agency. And this fabulous woman, Peggy, said to me, Janette, you're not going to fulfill all of your ambitions in the one spot. And I worked at Clemenger for like 15 years. So you sort of become a bit institutionalized where you are. And I said, well, what do you mean, Peggy? I can sort of see my pathway mapped out here. And she said, well, I'm not suggesting you leave, but I'm suggesting that you start doing things outside your day job. And it was the best advice anyone ever gave me. That was really when I started. Peggy said to me, look, you love being on the board of Clemenger. Why don't you look outside of Clemenger to do some board work? And that started me thinking about, well, that's sort of a good pathway to get some experience to what I want to do later on in at some point in time in my future. So I actually was appointed to the board of the Melbourne Festival of the Arts, Melbourne International Festival of the Arts, which I served on that board for 6 years. I also got appointed to the board of, I'm an alumni of Monash, and Monash was setting up a digital company, and they asked me to join the board of a company called Monash Digital, which I think we're all still grappling with what digital was about then. I took on a few advisory board roles. I was invited to join the advisory board of the AFL Players Association, which was just completely fascinating, getting an insight into the lives and challenges of young football players. And I also got involved with the FLORI, the Brain Research Institute at Melbourne Uni. So as I mentioned, I left Clemenger after 15 years. I became the CEO of an online media company when no one was advertising online. So that was pretty wild. I remember one of my meetings, I signed a contract with 2 young men, and they were the Bassett brothers, and we were entering into a contract to sell advertising on their website that they'd just established called Seek. And it's just amazing now to go, oh my God, the Bassett brothers were doing this little startup, and as I was CEO, we were trying to sell advertising on their website for them when no one advertised online. We did a bit of work with the Defence Force. They were playing around with the internet then, trying to recruit people, but that was about it. But it was fun and exciting, and we all had no idea what we were really doing. We were learning on the way. We had big visions for how the internet was going to change the world, and it took longer than we'd envisaged. But what we're experiencing today was what we were getting excited about in the mid-1990s and in 2000 when I was the CEO of Image. I then flipped my career. So the big risk for me, I walked away from everything that I knew in marketing and advertising and digital, and I took on an operations role. I joined Pacific Brands. I was the general manager of Whole Proof Socks. I was running a factory out in Nunawading, and that was my introduction to China as well, because we had a lot of manufacturing up in China as well. It was pretty terrifying. I remember sitting out in my office one night and thinking, oh my God, what in the hell have I done? Why am I here? I've never, worked in manufacturing before. I've never worked in operations. And I had to really draw breath and just go, okay, well, clearly they saw something in me. Maybe it was because the division needed turning around. It was in an absolute diabolical state, and maybe they thought, oh well, we'll give it to her because I don't know that she can do much more damage to it. Anyway, I won't go into the details of it, but we turned the division around and drove a lot of innovation and success in revenue and profit growth. It was a great experience for me, really thinking about my transferable skills, but also filling in the gaps of things that I didn't know. I joined at the time my first listed board role, which Rachel mentioned, Foodworks, the supermarket group, and continued to work on that board across Pac Brands. And then I left Pac Brands and joined Crown, as I mentioned before. A big learning curve for me at Crown was really property development. So we were redeveloping the Crown complex, I think with about a $2 billion budget to redevelop And I got heavily involved in property, which has served me well in my experience as a director on the board of Vicinity. Very quickly after a number of years, I left Crown. I got rung up by a search firm in Hong Kong with the opportunity to go and work for Galaxy in Macau in China, which I had never intended doing. I didn't intend to stay in the gaming industry, but I decided it was time to tip our lives upside down and go and do something different. And we did. It was a great adventure. It was extraordinary being part of a predominantly Chinese executive team, working with the most extraordinary, talented group of people. I had a team of about 600 people. When I arrived in Macau, the property had only been open for 6 months. It was already the size of Crown in Melbourne, but it was only a quarter built. So that was stage one. It had 20,000 employees, and it was like a startup with 20,000 employees. To try and operationalize this big monster was quite a challenge, but a really rich experience for me, both from tipping my world upside down. I had no network, I had no contacts, I had no shorthand to do anything. And also I loved having a deep cultural experience and an understanding of working in a different culture as well. There were lots of other stories I could tell you, but that's for when we meet over a glass of wine, about gangsters and the dark side of working in Macau and all the criminal elements of it and the characters that make up the gaming industry. I did leave as they cracked down on corruption, and that's a whole other story about the dark side of the gaming industry. Just to finish off on the risks and the saying yes and overcommitting leads me to the juggle. And as we all know, both for men and women, raising kids is not easy. I had that short maternity leave. I just remember the serious lack of sleep. And I still, what stands out for me was dealing with the bias as well. I remember we were sitting in a board meeting and we were going to go up to Sydney, and one of the other directors, they were all men, and he turned to me, and he was a lovely man. He wasn't being funny, but he just said to me, "Janette, what do you do when you go to Sydney?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, well, he said, "I just get on the plane and go." And I said, "Well, yeah, that's what I do." And then he just looked at me perplexed, and he said, "But what about the kid?" And I said, "Well, my husband's there to look after him." And he was like, "Do you know what?" He said, "In my whole career, I've never had to think about that." He said, "I've never even consulted my wife on that. I just go, I just do it." And I thought that was, it was great honesty from him. But it really showed me that, in a sense, he was looking at me thinking my life was like his, and how in the hell would I be able to, go and do that when I was the wife? And he couldn't imagine his wife doing that. I remember another horrible time. I mean, that one wasn't so horrible, but it was just interesting. Another horrible time was, and those of you who are mothers on this call know what it's like waking up and doing the 5 o'clock feed, and you're exhausted, but it's actually, when you're working, it's too late to go back to bed, but it's sort of too early. But you just keep going, and you get ready and you get into work. You might have fed the baby and then express. So if you're not going to be there during the day, the baby gets fed from express milk, and then you have to rush home for the 6 o'clock feed. And I remember rushing out of work. So having weeks like that or months like that, and rushing out of work at 5 o'clock, which no one ever left an agency at 5 o'clock. But anyway, I'm rushing out the door, and the CEO sees me at the top of the stairs and jokingly says, "Oh, what, Janette, half day today?" So I was speechless. And then he said, "Oh, right, you're off home. What, what's for dinner tonight? Chops and 3 veg?" And I was just speechless over it. And I guess, it was just he didn't mean it maliciously, but it was just all that, to me, it's still those standout memories of the of the biases and assumptions and barriers, in a sense, that are put in front of us that just make the job a hell of a lot harder. Like, wouldn't it? I love it today in organizations where there is so much recognition and support for what both men and women have got to do in raising children. And I just felt that just was like an extra weight on my shoulders, that there wasn't much support, there wasn't much empathy and understanding. I wasn't wanting sympathy, I just wanted some support and recognition for what I was doing. I think too, I mentioned my husband, Peter. He has been an extraordinary life partner, and I am blessed in having, and I acknowledge his mother, who I didn't ever met. She sadly passed away when he was quite young, but I suspect she was a bit out of sync with the rest of the world. She raised him as an independent person who knew how to iron and wash, and I don't think I've ever ironed a shirt of Peter's, and he loves being a dad, and he loves being very active in raising our children. I think too, part of the other challenges with all of that was dealing with the guilt. You know, there were times I didn't blindly go off on my career path, not ever thinking and reflecting and feeling the guilt that I wasn't there all the time. You know, I felt guilty for potentially not being a good mother, whatever a good mother is. I felt guilty for liking work as much as I did. I felt guilty for being driven and ambitious. So, you know, that's pretty tough to deal with that stuff too. You know, it's not all beer and Skittles, as many of you, in fact, all of you will know on the call. Having said that, I do want you to think about the risks that you're taking. The risks are worth it. Flipping your career is worth it. Changing jobs is worth it. Doesn't work out all the time. You know, the stuff that didn't work out for me was the stuff that I did learn the most from. I learned the most about myself. And I used to reflect on how can I be successful in one environment and then not successful in another environment. You know, I had setbacks and disappointments and felt failure along the way as well, but I don't regret taking risks. And I would encourage you not to shy away from them. I think I would encourage you to say yes more often than no. And, you know, I'd really question, is your partner, you know, supporting what you're doing and doing an equal amount of raising the kids and sharing the household responsibilities? Because without that, you know, it's hard to have your all, if to just link back to the theme. I think finally, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on the importance of networks and mentors and advocates. And really, this is where I'll tell you a little bit more about my board journey. I came back from Australia, and it was really a turning point for me, realizing that long-held ambition that I set at 28 was now. I sort of went, oh my God, I didn't ever set a date, but I think this is the time. You know, I came back to Australia. There was a big push to get more women on ASX 200 boards. A thing called the 30% Club had formed, and they were advocating strongly the case for diversity of skills and gender. And now we're seeing a big push, thank God, for cultural diversity on boards. But the 30% Club were really interesting in that they were out in the media advocating the case for women on boards. They were pushing the investor community to vote down REM reports if chairs were not making the move in putting more women on their boards. There was a huge push for different skills beyond lawyers and accountants, and they are absolutely critical and valuable on boards, but there was much more of a push for people who had digital skills and had skills in the consumer part of the market too, so we could have conversations in the boardroom about our customers. And you'll remember the fallout from the Banking Royal Commission being critical of boards not considering customers. So with my skills and experience in digital and consumer, that was really attractive when I came back from China. I'd been a member of the AICD, the Company Directors Institute, for a long time, but I'd never been an active member. I came back and I actually did the company directors course, and anyone on the call that's a company director, hopefully you've done it. If not, I would encourage you to do it. And even if you're not a company director, as an executive, I'd encourage you to do it. I also applied for and was successful in being selected for the Company Directors Chairs Mentoring Program. And this is where the bit about the importance of mentors comes in. I was mentored by a gentleman called Peter Hay, who was a chairman of ASX top 30 companies. And I spent a year meeting with Peter once a month, and we'd talk about formulating my director's CV. We'd talk about what skills and experience I had that were relevant to different boards. We talked about how to find positions on boards, what industries and sectors appealed to me, and where I could have maybe able to add some value. I spent a lot of time talking to Peter about what chairs look for in directors. And he spent a lot of time really encouraging me and giving me belief in myself that I could one day step onto the board of an ASX 200 company, which, to be honest, even though I was doing the mentoring program, I didn't think that was going to be possible. I became quite strategic in how I thought about it. I set up a spreadsheet. I downloaded the ASX 200. I looked at every company. I looked at who their chairs were. I looked at the makeup of their boards for skills and gender diversity. I looked to see if there was anyone like me on these boards. And then I started meeting chairs. And I discovered that chairs of ASX 200 companies like meeting emerging directors. And that's actually how I got on the board of Costa. I met with Neil Chatfield. I actually wanted to be on the board of Seek, and which is funny about my Seek story from 2000. But I had Seek in my sights, and Neil, who's the chair of Costa, was also the chair of Seek. And I went along thinking that I was going to have a conversation with him about Seek, and halfway through the conversation, he said, "Oh, Janette, with your skills and experience, you'd be a great director on Seek." And I thought, oh my God, all my Christmases have come at once. I can't believe he's talking to me about that. And he said, "But I want to talk to you about Costa." And anyway, as you know, where that ended, I ended up joining the board of Costa with absolutely no experience in horticulture at all. But I've learned a lot, and hopefully I've been able to contribute and add value to Costa as a company. When I came back from China, I was approached to join the board of the MTC, which Rachel mentioned before. I love the arts. I'm a passionate supporter of the arts, and was on the board of the MTC for 6 years. I joined the board of 9. I was on that board up until the conclusion of the takeover of Fairfax. And Rachel mentioned my other board's Vicinity, Visit Victoria. I did a consulting project with Visit Victoria during COVID. It's another board that I joined at the beginning of COVID, and helped them with their recovery strategy for the tourism industry. And as I mentioned, I'm on the board of Tabcorp. So I guess in wrapping up, I really have fulfilled my long-term career goal. I love doing what I'm doing. Friends and allies said to me at the time, well, I was surprised that it happened. They weren't, and I was sort of a bit perplexed that they weren't surprised. And they said, "Well, don't you realize you've shared that long-term ambition with me? And I knew that that's something that you always wanted to do." So I would say to you, in setting your long-term career goal, don't be shy about telling people that what it is that you want to do. I think build your plan. I think you do need to be a bit strategic and structured in how you go about it. I'd encourage you to support others in your journey. For me, it's mentor walks in the ANCDW. Doing all these things build your networks. Like, it is rich and rewarding, but it's also really important to think about who you're advocating for, and who is your support crew, and whose support crew are you in doing that. I think, in closing, before we open for a couple of quick questions, I think we've got about 5 to 10 minutes for it, but you know, if having it all appeals to you, work out what your all is. Set some long-term career and life goals and let it be known. Say yes more often than no, and take some risks. Broaden your network, find a mentor or be a mentor, find an advocate or be an advocate. Find ways to share the load. you know, I'm a great believer in outsourcing. It doesn't mean my kids were home alone and miss me. We have great relationships with our kids. Careful who you marry if you're not married yet. I do tell lots of young people that. And importantly, during International Women's Day week, make sure you find another woman and see what you can do for her, because you know what, it can be pretty lonely out there on your own as you're doing this stuff. But I hope what I've said today has given you some insight into my crazy journey and given you some tips and inspiration for, as I said, finding your all.